This year, we expanded our backyard garden from 4x4 raised beds to 4x12 beds and a greenhouse. Even though I've gardened for years, this is a whole new territory for me because it's the first time I'm taking my garden seriously as a true source of food and nutrition for my family. As we are shifting our lifestyle to a more suburban homestead way of living, the way I'm thinking about gardening is changing. So I want to share with you some of the gardening mistakes I've made this year and what I've learned along the way so far. Without a doubt, the number one mistake I made in my garden this year is not planning. To be honest, I've never really planned my garden before because I didn't really have to. I had a limited amount of space and I kind of knew what worked and what didn't. I was pretty familiar with it. So this time though, with my new garden, it's 3 times the size of my old one and I grossly underestimated how many plants I would need. About 6 weeks before the last frost or so, I started a bunch of seedlings in my guest room closet and I eventually moved them into my greenhouse. And all went well, everything germinated fine, and then I put them in my garden and I had a ton of extra space. And because I had not planned, I actually did not know what else to put in there because I was so used to this old garden of mine and like how to plant things and where to plant things and what I usually grow. I didn't really know what to plant. So then I went to the local nursery and bought all these plants that were kind of expensive, at least compared to starting them from seeds. And I had to figure out a way to plant them in my garden. And honestly, even though I think everything is fine, it is not done the way that I think I would have done it had I planned ahead. This mistake spilled over into a whole new area of experimenting in the garden. I recently came across a gardening method that recommends planting your plants closer together. And though I don't actually know how that will work and if it will even work at all, this particular method really spoke to me. So I'm giving it a try. But now not only do I have more garden space that I know what to do with, I'm also trying to plant slightly closer together. I am not a gardening expert or gardening teacher by any stretch of the imagination, so I don't have a lot of advice for you because I'm still learning as we go. But the one piece of advice I think I would give to anyone starting a garden is plan ahead. It just would have made things easier had I planned ahead of time and had a better sense of not just what I was planting, but how I was going to plant it in my garden. I really wish I would have taken more time and more care to think about what I want my garden to look like, how I want to arrange the plants, figuring out the companion plants a little bit better, and so on. I just think it would have made things a little bit easier from the get-go, and probably, I guess the jury's still out, it's still early in the season, but my guess is it'll probably make for a more fruitful harvest later on too. What you're seeing here is me chopping up some fresh herbs from the garden to put on my breakfast, which leads me into my next mistake, which is not understanding the seasons. For years, I have complained that there is not enough time from the last frost date until it's about 10,000 degrees here in Wilmington, North Carolina, to grow anything that is cool. All the seed packs and all the information you see on the internet always says to wait until after the last frost, and I always do that. But here in Wilmington, North Carolina, at the beach in southeastern North Carolina, it is really hot. Often by like mid-March, we have these like heat waves, and then by April, sometimes it's upwards of 90 degrees. So there's no real time for cool weather vegetables. So the problem or the mistake that I made is not understanding that it's not always about the date, it's about the warm, hot, and cool seasons. So for me, I really should have been starting my cilantro, for example, because all I really wanted to do for this season is grow a ton of cilantro and freeze dry it. So I have it for a long time. But I really should have started my cilantro a long time ago. It would have grown, but I waited until after the last frost date and it was already too hot for it to grow. It's completely stunted and I don't have any cilantro growing. I know for some of you watching this, you're probably thinking like, duh, but this is actually new information for me. I've always just looked at the back of the seed packs. I just paid attention to the dates and planted that way. But I learned recently on a podcast that you really have to think about it not as dates, but as the seasons of temperature. Those little pots of seedlings that you just saw me stack, they were actually all seedlings that I should have started months ago that I started way too late. So I took all this time and care to nurture them them for them to only do nothing, but at least I know for next time. But now that I'm armed with this new information, it's completely changed the way I'm thinking about planting and when to plant both my spring garden and my fall garden, because traditionally I have had not much luck with either. But I think now that I have this new shift in perspective, that is about to change. A few videos ago, I mentioned that this was the first year that we got our soil tested. It was really cheap through our cooperative extension. I think it was like $4 or something like that. And though getting our soil tested was not a mistake, I totally recommend doing that if you haven't done it already, but not having an actionable method in place was a mistake. So once we got the soil report, we didn't know what to do with it. I want to stay committed to organic gardening, but it's been a struggle to figure out the best way to amend our soil organically based upon the report. And of course, if you look online, you get 1,000 different answers. So it's been a little unclear how we should amend our soil. So the report had a couple of things on it. One, they don't test for nitrogen because they say it's unstable, so they can't really test for it. So I don't actually know how much nitrogen to put in our soil, but they also said it's high in potassium. So I'm assuming the best way to level the potassium out is through potassium loving plants, but I'm not entirely sure. They also said the pH was off, and I honestly don't really know how to fix these things. And when I look it up on the internet, there's 10,000 different suggestions. I never know which is the right one. And my guess is they're probably all correct for the most part, but they are all just different ways of doing it. I found over the years that most of the time, lots of things are correct, but you just have to pick the method that works for you. And the mistake I made is I didn't have a method or a plan in place. And I still don't really have a clear vision for what method would work the best for us because I don't fully understand all of them. But I am glad that I'm starting to gather this insight because it will help me in the long run to start figuring this out and to choose the practices and the methods that work the best for our garden, the area that we live in, and for our general lifestyle and what we're trying to do with our garden. I recently listened to a podcast with Nicole Johnsey Burke of Gardenary, and she really inspired me to think about my garden differently. So a lot of these quote mistakes that I have been sharing in this video have come from that podcast and learning a lot about her method. And one of the things she mentioned is diversifying where you plant in your garden. And this is a mistake I've made not just this year, but every single year I've ever gardened. I've always put all my tomatoes in one bed and all my peppers in another bed and all my herbs in another bed. And even though I actually had pretty abundant gardens most years, I have a hunch this would have worked better. Now, I've always known about companion planting, like planting tomatoes and basil, for example. I honestly haven't done it. I don't know why. I'm just stubborn. I am doing it this year. But also what I learned from that is that when you diversify where you put plants in your garden, you can also reduce pest pressure and disease pressure. So when you look at my garden right now, you can kind of see the moment when I learned this because I have all my herbs in one row and in one bed and everything's nice and tidy. And then suddenly that stops and there's a lot of variation in the ways that I'm planting things and the other beds are more diversified. So I'm giving this a try to see how it works. But I do think that one of the mistakes I have made in the past is not thinking differently about how I diversify my plants in my raised beds. But the truth is that if it's worth trying, it's worth failing. So I don't even know if the remedies for some of these mistakes will even work. In my mind, though, it's worth a shot. The absolute worst case scenario is that I'll know what doesn't work for next time. And often in gardening and in life in general, knowing what doesn't work is more important than knowing what does. Mistakes or not, though, we have this beautiful space that we are cultivating in our own yard that we work in together as a family and enjoy. So no matter which way you slice it, mistakes or not, in my mind, this garden is alive and well.